Fuck. Okay. Okay. My mic was off. Okay. Well, damn me. I guess I'll start over. Because it's in the fascist spirit. Nothing keeps me down, okay? I'm starting over. The Doctrine of Fascism, written in 1932 by Benito Mussolini and ghostwritten by Giovanni Gentile. Like all sound political conceptions, fascism is action, and it is thought, action in which doctrine is immanent, and doctrine arising from a given system of historical forces in which it is inserted, and working on them from within. It is therefore a form correlated to contingencies of time and space, but it is also an ideal content which makes it an expression of truth in the higher region of the history of thought. There is no way of exercising a spiritual influence in the world as a human will dominating the will of others, unless one has a conception both of the transient and the specific reality on which that action is to be exercised, and of the permanent and universal reality in which the transient dwells and has its being. To know men, one must know man, and to know man, one must be acquainted with reality and its laws. There can be no conception of the state which is not fundamentally a conception of life. Philosophy, or intuition, system of ideas evolving within the framework of logic, or concentrated in a vision, or a faith, but always, at least potentially, an organic conception of the world. Okay. Thus, many of the practical expressions of fascism, such as party organization, system of education, and discipline, can only be understood when considered in relation to its general attitude towards life, a spiritual attitude. Fascism sees in the world not only those superficial, material aspects in which man appears as an individual, standing by himself, self-centered, subject to natural law, which instinctively urges him towards a life of selfish momentary pleasure. It sees not only the individual, but the nation and the country, individuals and generations bound together by a moral law, which, with common traditions, and a mission, which, suppressing the instinct for life closed in a brief circle of pleasure, builds up a higher life, founded on duty, a life free from the limitations of time and space, in which the individual, by self-sacrifice, the renunciation of self-interests, by death itself, can achieve that purely spiritual existence in which his value as a man consists. The conception of life is therefore a spiritual one, arising from the general reaction of the century against the materialistic positivism of the 19th century. Anti-positivistic but positive, neither skeptical nor agnostic, neither pessimistic nor supinely optimistic as are, generally speaking, the doctrines, all negative, which place the center of life outside man. Whereas by the exercise of his free will, man can and must create his own world. Fascism wants man to be active and to engage in action with all of his energies. It wants him to be manfully aware of the difficulties besetting him and ready to face them. It conceives of life as a struggle in which it behooves a man to win for himself a really worthy place. First of all, by fitting himself, physically, morally, and intellectually, to become the implement required for winning it. As for the individual, so for the nation, and so for mankind. Hence the high value of culture in all its forms, artistic, religious, scientific, and the outstanding importance of education. Hence also the essential value of work by which man subjugates nature and creates the human world, economic, political, ethical, and intellectual. This positive conception of life is obviously an ethical one. It invests the whole field of reality as well as the human activities which master it. No action is exempt from moral judgment. No activity can be despoiled of the value which a moral purpose confers on all things. Therefore life, as conceived of by the fascist, is serious, austere, and religious. All its manifestations are poised in a world sustained by moral forces and subject to spiritual responsibilities. The fascist disdains an easy life. The fascist conception of life is a religious one, in which man is viewed in his immanent relation to a higher law, endowed with an objective will transcending the individual and raising him to conscious membership of a spiritual society. Quote, those who perceive nothing beyond opportunistic considerations in the religious policy of the fascist regime fail to realize that fascism is not only a system of government, but also, and above all, a system of thought. In the fascist conception of history, man is only by virtue of the spiritual processes to which he contributes as a member of the family, the social group, the nation, and in function of history to which all nations bring their contribution, hence the great value of tradition in records, in language, in customs, in the rules of social life. Outside history, man is a non-entity. Fascism is therefore opposed to all individualistic abstractions based on 18th century materialism, and it is opposed to all Jacobinistic utopias and innovations. It does not believe in the possibility of happiness on earth as conceived by the economic literature of the 18th century, and it therefore rejects the theological notion that at some future time the human family will secure a final settlement of all its difficulties. The notion runs counter to experience, which teaches sorry there. This notion runs counter to experience, which teaches that life is in continual flux and in process of evolution. In politics, fascism aims at realism. In practice, it desires to deal only with those problems which are the spontaneous product of historic conditions and which find or suggest their own solutions. Only by entering into the processes of reality and taking possession of the forces at work within it can man act on man and on nature. Anti-individualistic, the fascist conception of life stresses the importance of the state and accepts the individual only insofar as his interests coincide with those of the state, which stands for the conscience and the universal will of a man as a historic entity. It is opposed to classical liberalism, which arose as a reaction to absolutism and exhausted its historical function when the state became the expression of the conscience and will of the people. Liberalism denied the state in the name of the individual. Fascism reasserts this. The right of the state as expressing the real essence of the individual, and if liberty is to be the attribute, and if liberty is to he the attribute of living men, and not of abstract dummies invented by individualistic liberalism, then fascism stands for liberty, and for the only liberty worth having, the liberty of the state and of the individual within the state. The fascist conception of the state is all-embracing. Outside of it, no human or spiritual values can exist, much less have value. Thus understood, fascism is totalitarian, and the fascist state, a synthesis and a unit inclusive of all values, interprets, develops, and potentates the whole life of a people. No individuals or groups, political parties, cultural associations, economic unions, social classes outside the state. Fascism is therefore opposed to socialism, to which unity within the state, which amalgamates classes into a single economic and ethical reality, is unknown, and which sees in history nothing but the class struggle. Fascism is likewise opposed to trade unionism as a class weapon, but when brought within the orbit of the state, fascism recognizes the real needs which give rise to socialism and trade unionism, giving them due weight in the guild or corporative system, in which divergent interests are coordinated and harmonized in the unity of the state. This is corporatism. Grouped according to their several interests, individuals form classes, they form trade unions, when organized according to their several economic activities, but first and foremost they form the state, which is no mere matter of numbers, the sons of the individuals forming the majority. Fascism is therefore opposed to that form of democracy which equates a nation to the majority, lowering it to the level of the largest number, but it is the purest form of democracy if the nation be considered as it should be from the point of view of quality rather than quantity. As an idea, the mightiest because the most ethical, the most coherent, the truest, expressing itself in a people as the conscience and will of the few, if not indeed of one, and expressing and ending to express itself in the conscience and the will of the mass, of the whole group, ethnically molded by natural and historical conditions into a nation, advancing as one conscience and one will, along the self-same line of development and spiritual formation, not a race, nor a geographically defined region, but a people, historically perpetuating itself, a multitude unified by an idea and imbued with the will to live, the will to power, self-conscious personality. Insofar as it is embodied in a state, the higher personality becomes a nation. It is not the nation which generates the state. That is an antiquated naturalistic concept which afforded a basis for 19th century publicity in favor of national governments. Rather, it is the state which creates the nation, conferring volition and therefore real life on a people made aware of their moral unity. The right to national independence does not arise from any merely literary and idealistic form of self-consciousness, still less from a more or less passive and unconscious de facto situation, but from an active, self-conscious, political will, expressing itself in action and ready to prove its rights. It arises, in short, from the existence, at least in theory, of a state. Indeed, it is the state which, as the expression of a universal ethical will, creates the right to national independence. A nation, as expressed in the state, is a living, ethical entity only insofar as it is progressive. Inactivity is surely death. Therefore, the state is not only authority which governs and confers legal form and spiritual value onto individual wills, but it is also power which makes its will felt and respected beyond its own frontiers, thus affording practical proof of the universal character of the decisions necessary to ensure its development. This implies organization and expansion, potential if not actual. Thus the state equates itself to the will of man, whose development cannot be checked by obstacles, and which, by achieving self-expression, demonstrates its infinity. The fascist state, as a higher and more powerful expression of personality, is a force, but a spiritual one. It sums up all the manifestations of the moral and intellectual life of man. Its functions cannot therefore be limited to those of enforcing order and keeping the peace, as the liberal doctrine had it. It is no mere mechanical device for defining the sphere within which the individual may duly exercise his supposed rights. The fascist state is an inwardly accepted standard and rule of conduct, a discipline of the whole person. It permeates the will no less than the intellect. It stands for a principle which becomes the central motive of man as a member of civilized society, sinking deep down into his personality. It dwells in the heart of the man of action and of the thinker, of the artist, and of the man of science, the soul of the soul. Fascism, in short, is not only a lawgiver and a founder of institutions, but an educator and a promoter of spiritual life. It aims at refashioning not only the forms of life, but their content, man, his character, and his faith. To achieve this purpose, it enforces discipline and uses authority, entering into the soul and ruling with undisputed sway. Therefore, it has chosen as its emblem the lictor's rods, the symbol of unity, strength, and justice, also known as the fasces. Political and social doctrine. A second section. When in the now distant March of 1919, speaking through the columns of the Popolo d'Italia, I summoned to Milan the surviving interventionists who had intervened and who had followed me ever since the foundation of the fascist of revolutionary action in January 1915. I had in no mind no specific doctrinal program. The only doctrine of which I had practical experience was that of socialism. Until the winter of 1914, nearly a decade, my experience was that both of a follower and a leader. But it was not doctrinal experience. My doctrine during that period had been the doctrine of action. A uniform, universally accepted doctrine of socialism had not existed since 1915, when the revisionist movement, headed by Bernstein, arose in Germany, countered by the formation, in the seesaw of tendencies, of a left revolutionary movement which in Italy never quitted the field of phrases, where, as in the case of Russian socialism, it became the prelude to Bolshevism. Reformism, revolutionism, centrism, the very echo of that terminology is dead. While on the great river of fascism, one can trace currents which had their source in Sorel, Pagai, Lagardelle of the movement socialists, and in the cohort of Italian syndicalists who from 1904 to 1914 brought a new note into the Italian socialist environment, previously emasculated and chloroformed by fornicating with Giolidi's party, a note sounded in Olivetti's Pagini Liberi, Orano's Lupa, Enrico Leone's Devenir Sociales. When the war ended in 1919, socialism, as a doctrine, was already dead. It continued to exist only as a grudge, especially in Italy, where its only chance lay in inciting to reprisals against the men who had willed the war and who were to be made to pay for it. The Popolo d'Italia described itself in its subtitle as the daily organ of fighters and producers. The word producer was already the expression of a mental trend. Fascism was not the nursling of a doctrine previously drafted at a desk. It was born of the need of action, and was action. It was not a party, but, in the first 2 years, an anti-party and a movement. The name I gave the organization fixed its character. Yet if anyone cares to reread the now crumpled sheets of those days, giving an account of the meeting at which the Italian Fasci di Combattimento were founded, he will find not a doctrine, but a series of pointers, forecasts, hints, which, when freed from the inevitable matrix of contingencies, were to develop in a few years' time into a series of doctrinal positions, entitling fascism to rank as a political doctrine, differing from all others, past or present. If the bourgeoisie, I then said, believe that they have found in us their lightning conductors, they are mistaken. We must go towards the people. We wish the working classes to accustom themselves to the responsibilities of management, so that they may realize that it is no easy matter to run a business. We will fight both technical and spiritual rearguardism. Now that the succession of the regime is open, we must not be faint-hearted. We must rush forward. If the present regime is to be superseded, we must take its place. The right of secession is ours, for we urged the country to enter the war, and we led it to victory. The existing forms of political representation cannot satisfy us. We want direct representation of the several interests. It may be objected that this program implies a return to the guilds, corporazioni. No matter. I therefore hope this assembly will accept the economic claims advanced by national syndicalism. It is not strange that from the very first day, at Piazza San Sepolcro, the word guild was pronounced, a word which, as the revolution developed, was to express one of the basic legislative and social creations of the regime. The years preceding the March on Rome cover a period during which the needs of action forbade delay and careful doctrinal elaborations. Fighting was going on in the towns and villages. There were discussions, but there was something more sacred and more important: death. Fascists knew how to die. A doctrine, fully elaborated, divided up into chapters and paragraphs with annotations, may have been lacking, but is replaced by something far more decisive, by a faith. All the same, if with the help of books, articles, resolutions passed at congresses, major and minor speeches, anyone should care to revive the memory of those days, he will find, provided he know how to seek and select, that the doctrinal foundations were laid while the battle was still raging. Indeed, it was during those years that fascist thought armed, refined itself, and proceeded ahead with its organization. The problem of the individual and the state, the problems of authority and liberty, political, social, and more especially national problems were discussed. They conflict with liberal, democratic, socialistic, Masonic doctrines, and with those of the Partito Popolare was carried on at the same time as the punitive expeditions. Nevertheless, the lack of a formal system was used by disingenuous adversaries as an argument for proclaiming fascism incapable of elaborating a doctrine at the very time when that doctrine was being formulated. No matter how tumultuously, first, as it is the case with all new ideas, in the guise of violent dogmatic negotiations, then in the more positive guise of constructive theories, subsequently incorporated in 1926, 1927, and 1928 in the laws and institutions of the regime. Fascism is now clearly defined not only as a regime, but as a doctrine. This means that fascism, exercising its critical faculties on itself and on others, has studied from its own special standpoint and judged by its own standards all the problems affecting the material and intellectual interests now causing such grave anxiety to the nations of the world, and is ready to deal with them by its own policies. First of all, as regards to the future development of mankind, and quite apart from all present political considerations, Fascism does not, generally speaking, believe in the possibility or utility of perpetual peace. It therefore discards pacifism as a cloak for cowardly supine renunciation and contradiction, in contradistinction to self-sacrifice. War alone keys up all human energies to their maximum tensions and sets the seal of nobility on those people who have the courage to face it. All other tests are substitutes which never place a man face to face with himself before the alternative of life or death. Therefore, all doctrines which postulate peace at all costs are incompatible with fascism. Equally foreign to the spirit of fascism, even if accepted as useful in meeting special political situations, are all internationalistic or league superstructures, which, as history shows, crumble to the ground whenever the heart of nations is deeply stirred by the sentimental, idealistic, or practical considerations. Fascism carries this anti-pacifistic attitude into the life of the individual. I don't care a damn. Me ne frego, the proud motto of the fighting squad scrawled by a wounded man on his bandages, is not only an act of philosophic stoicism, it sums up a doctrine which is not merely political. It is evidence of a fighting spirit which accepts all risks. It signifies new style of Italian life. A fascist accepts and loves life. He rejects and despises suicide as cowardly. Life as he understands it means duty, elevation, conquest. Life must be lofty and full. It must be lived for oneself, but above all for others. It must be lived for oneself, but above all for others, both nearby and far off, present and future. Sorry. The population policy of the regime is the consequence of these premises. The fascist loves his neighbor, but the word neighbor does not stand for some vague and unseizable conception. Love of one's neighbor does not exclude necessary educational severity. Still less does it exclude differentiation and rank. Fascism will have nothing to do with universal embraces. As a member of the community of nations, it looks other people straight in the eyes. It is vigilant and on its guard. It follows others in all their manifestations and notes any changes in their interests. It does not allow itself to be deceived by mutable and fallacious appearances. Such a conception of life makes fascism the resolute negation of the doctrine underlying so-called scientific and Marxian socialism, the doctrine of historic materialism, which would explain the history of mankind in terms of the class struggle and by changes in the processes and instruments of production to the exclusion of all else. That the vicissitudes of economic life, discoveries of raw materials, new technical processes, and scientific inventions have their importance, no one denies, but that they suffice to explain human history to the exclusion of other factors is totally absurd. Fascism believes now and always in sanctity and heroism, that is to say in acts in which no economic motive, remote or immediate, is at work, having denied historic materialism, which sees in men mere puppets on the surface of history, appearing and disappearing on the crest of the waves, while in the depths the real directing forces move and work. Fascism also denies the immutable and irreparable character of the class struggle, which is the natural outcome of this economic conception of history. Above all, it denies that the class struggle is the preponderating agent in social transformations, having thus struck a blow with socialism in the two main points of its doctrine. All that remains of it is the sentimental aspiration old as humanity itself towards social relations in which the sufferings and sorrows of the humbler folk will be alleviated. But here again, fascism rejects the economic interpretations of felicity as something to be secured socialistically, almost automatically, at a given stage of economic evolution, when all will be assured a maximum of materialistic comfort. Fascism denies the materialistic conception of happiness as a possibility and abandons it to the economists of the mid-18th century. This means that fascism denies the equation well-being equals happiness, which sees in men mere animals, content when they can feed and fatten, thus reducing them to a vegetative existence, pure and simple. After socialism, fascism trains its guns on the whole block of democratic ideologies and rejects both their premises and their practical applications and implements. Fascism denies that numbers, as such, can be the determining factor in human society. It denies the right of the numbers to govern by means of periodical consultations. It asserts the irremediable and fertile and beneficent inequality of men who cannot be leveled by any such mechanical and extrinsic device as universal suffrage. Democratic regimes may be described as those under which the people are, from time to time, deluded into the belief that they exercise sovereignty, while all the time real sovereignty resides in and is exercised by other and sometimes irresponsible and secret forces. Democracy is a kingless regime infested by many kings who are sometimes more exclusive, tyrannical, and destructive than one, even if he be a tyrant. This explains why fascism, although for contingent reasons, it was Republican in tendency prior to 1922, abandoned that stand before the March on Rome. Let me repeat this. Although for contingent reasons, it was Republican in tendency prior to 2022, where it abandoned that stand before the March on Rome, convinced that the form of government is no longer a matter of preeminent importance, And because the study of past and present monarchies and past and present republics, so that neither monarchy nor republic can be judged sub specie aeternit can be judged sub specie aeternitatis, Latin, yeesh, but that each stands for a form of government expressing the political evolution, the history, the traditions, and the psychology of a given country. Fascism has outgrown the dilemma, monarchy versus republic, over which the democratic regimes too long dallied, attributing all insufficiencies to the former and proning the latter as a regime of perfection, whereas experience teaches that some republics are inherently reactionary and absolutist, while some monarchies accept the most daring political and social experiments. In one of his philosophic meditations, Renan, who had pre-fascist intuitions, remarks, "Reason and science are the products of mankind, but it is chimerical to seek reason directly for the people, and through the people. It is not essential to the existence of reason that all should be familiar with it, and even if all had to be initiated, this cannot be achieved through democracy, which seems fated to lead to the extinction of all arduous forms of culture and all higher forms of leaning. The maxim that society exists only for the well-being and freedom of the individuals composing it does not seem to be in conformity with nature's plans, which care only for the species and seem ready to sacrifice the individual. It is much to be feared that the last words of democracy, thus understood, and let me hasten to add that it is susceptible of a different interpretation, would be a form of society in which a degenerate mass would have no thought beyond that of enjoying the ignoble pleasures of the vulgar." In rejecting democracy, fascism rejects the absurd conventional lie of political egalitarianism, the habit of collective irresponsibility, the myth of felicity and indefinite progress. But if democracy be understood as meaning as a regime in which the masses are not driven back to the margin of the state, then the writer of these pages has already and then but if democracy be understood as meaning a regime in which the masses are not driven back to the margin of the state, and then the writer of these pages has already defined fascism as an organized, centralized, authoritarian democracy. Fascism is definitely and absolutely opposed to the doctrines of liberalism, both in the political and the economic sphere. The importance of liberalism in the 19th century should not be exaggerated for present-day polemical purposes, nor should we make one of the many doctrines which flourished in that century a religion for mankind, for the present, and for all time to come. Liberalism really flourished for 15 years only. It arose in 1830 as a reaction to the Holy Alliance, which tried to force Europe to recede further back than 1789. It touched its zenith in 1848, when even Pius IX was a liberal. Its decline began immediately after that year. If 1848 was a year of light and poetry, 1980, 18, let me restart. Its decline began immediately after that year. If 1848 was a year of light and poetry, 1849 was a year of darkness and tragedy. The Roman Republic was killed by a sister republic, that of France. In that same year, Marx, in his famous Communist Manifesto, launched the gospel of socialism. In 1851, Napoleon III made his illiberal coup d'etat and ruled France until 1870, when he was turned out by a popular rising following one of the severest military defeats known to history. The victor was Bismarck, who never even knew the whereabouts of liberalism and its profits. It is symptomatic that throughout the 19th century, the religion of liberalism was a completely unknown to so highly civilized a people as the Germans, but for one parenthesis, which has been described as the ridiculous Parliament of Frankfurt, which lasted just one season. Germany attained her national unity outside liberalism, in opposition to liberalism, a doctrine which seems foreign to the German temperament, essentially monarchical, whereas liberalism is the historic and logical anteroom to anarchy. The three stages in the making of German unity were the three wars of 1864, 1866, and 1870, led by such liberals, in quotes, as Moltke and Bismarck. And in the upbuilding of Italian unity, liberalism played a very minor part when compared to the contribution made by Mazzini and Garibaldi, who were not liberals. For the intervention of the illiberal Napoleon III, we should not have had Lombardy. And without that of the illiberal Bismarck at Sadowa and at Sedan, very probably we should not have had Venetia in 1866, and in 1870 we should have not entered Rome. The years going from 1870 to 1915 cover a period which marked, even in the opinion of the high priest of the new creed, the twilight of their religion, attacked by decadentism in literature and by activism in practice. Activism, that is to say, nationalism, futurism, and fascism. The liberal century, after piling up innumerable Gordian knots, tried to cut them with the sword of the World War. Never has any religion claimed so cruel a sacrifice. Were the gods of liberalism thirsting for blood? Now liberalism is preparing to close the doors of its temples, deserted by the people who feel that the agnosticism it professed in the sphere of economics and the indifferentism of which it has given proof in the sphere of politics and morals would lead the world to ruin in the future as they have done in the past. This explains why the political experiments of our day are anti-liberal, and it is supremely ridiculous to endeavor on this account to put them outside the pale of history, as thought history were a preserve set aside for liberalism and its adepts, as though liberalism were the last word in civilization beyond which no one can go. The fascist negotiation of socialism, democracy, liberalism should not, however, be interpreted as implying a desire to drive the world backwards to positions occupied prior to 1789. A year commonly referred to as that which opened the democratic liberal century. History does not travel backwards. The fascist doctrine has not taken de Maistre as its prophet. Monarchical absolutism is of the past, and so its excelsoratory. Dead and done, for the feudal privileges and the division of society into the closed, uncommunicating castes. Neither has the fascist conception of authority anything in common with that of a police-ridden state. Keep that in mind. A party governing a nation totalitarianly in a totalitarian manner is a new departure in history. There are no points of reference nor of comparison. From beneath the ruins of liberal, socialist, and democratic doctrines, fascism extracts those elements which are still vital. It preserves what may be described as the acquired facts of history. Quote, it rejects all else. That is to say, it rejects the idea of a doctrine suited to all times and to all people. That's important too. Granted that the 19th century was the century of socialism, liberalism, democracy, this does not mean that the 20th century must also be the century of socialism, liberalism, and democracy. And neither does the 21st century. We are free to believe that this is the century of authority, a century leading to the right, a fascist century. If the 19th century was the century of the individual, liberalism implies individualism. We are free to believe that this is the collective century, and therefore the century of the state. It is quite logical for a new doctrine to make use of the still vital elements of other doctrines. No doctrine is ever born quite new and bright and unheard of. No doctrine can boast absolute originality. It is always connected, it only historically, with those which preceded it and those which will follow it. Thus the scientific socialism of Marx, links up to this utopian socialism of the Fouriers, the Owens, the Saint-Simons. Thus, the liberalism of the 19th century traces its origin back to the Illuministic movement of the 18th century, and the doctrines of democracy to those of the encyclopedists. All doctrines aim at directing the activity of men towards a given objective, but these activities, in their turn, react on the doctrine, modifying and adjusting it to new needs, or outstripping it. Doctrine must, therefore, be a vital act and not a verbal display. Hence the pragmatic strain in fascism. Its will to power, its will to live, its attitude toward violence, and its value. The keystone of the fascist doctrines is its conception of the state, of its essence, its functions, and its aims. For fascism, the state is absolute, individuals and groups relative. Individuals and groups are admissible insofar as they come within the state. Instead of directing the game and gilding the material and moral progress of the community, the liberal state restricts its activities to recording results. The fascist state is wide awake and has a will of its own. For this reason, it can be described as ethica. At the first quinquennial assembly of the regime in 1929, I said, quote, "The fascist state is not a night watchman, solicitous only of the personal safety of the citizens. Not is it organized exclusively for the purpose of guaranteeing a certain degree of material prosperity and relatively peaceful conditions of life. A board of directors would do as much. Neither is it exclusively political, divorced from practical realities and holding itself aloof from the multifarious activities of the citizens and the nation. The state, as conceived and realized by fascism, is a spiritual and ethical entity for securing the political, juridical, and economic organization of the nation, and organization, which in its origin and growth is a manifestation of the spirit. The state guarantees the internal and external safety of the country, but it also safeguards and transmits the spirit of the people, elaborated down the ages in its language, its customs, its faith. The state is not only the present, it is also the past, and above all the future, transcending the individual's brief spell of life. The state stands for the immanent conscience of the nation. The forms in which it finds expression change, but the need for it remains. The state educates the citizens to civism, makes them aware of their mission, urges them to unity. Its justice harmonizes their divergent interests. It transmits to future generations the conquests of the mind in the fields of science, art, law, human solidarity. It leads men up from primitive tribal life to that highest manifestation of human power, imperial rule. The state hands down to future generations not the memory of those who laid down their lives to ensure its safety or to obey its laws. It sets up as examples and records for future ages the names of the captains who enlarged its territories and of the men of genius who have made it famous. Whenever respect for the state declines and the disintegrating and centrifugal tendencies of individuals and groups prevail, nations are certainly headed for decay. End quote. Since 1929, economic and political developments have everywhere emphasized these truths. The importance of the state is rapidly growing. The so-called crisis can only be settled by the state action. Within the orbit of the state, where are the shades of the Jules Simmons who, in the early days of liberalism, proclaimed that the, quote, state should endeavor to render itself useless, prepare to hand in its resignation? Or of the McMullocks, McCullochs, who, in the second half of last century, urged that the state should desist from governing too much? And what of the English Bentham, who considered that all industry asked of government was to be left alone? And of the German Humboldt, who expressed the opinion that the best government was a lazy one? What will they say now to the unceasing, inevitable, and urgently requested interventions of government in business? It is true that the second generation of economists, was less uncompromising in this respect than the first, and that even Adam Smith left the door ajar, however cautiously, for government intervention in business. If liberalism spells individualism, fascism spells government. The fascist state is, however, a unique and original creation. It is not reactionary, but revolutionary, for it anticipates the solution of certain universal problems which have been raised elsewhere in the political field by the splitting up of parties, the usurpation of power by parliaments, the irresponsibility of assemblies, in the economic field by the increasingly numerous and important functions discharged by trade unions and trade associations with their disputes and ententes, affecting both capital and labor, in the ethical field by the need felt for order, discipline, obedience to the moral dictates of patriotism. Fascism desires the state to be strong and organic, based on the broad foundations of popular support. The fascist state lays claim to rule in the economic field no less than in others. It makes its action felt throughout the length and breadth of this country by means of its corporative, social, and educational institutions, and all the political, economic, and spiritual forces of the nation, organized in their respective associations, circulate within the state, a state based on millions of individuals who recognize its authority, feel its action, and are ready to serve its ends, is not the tyrannical state of a medieval lordling. It has nothing in common with the despotic states existing prior to or subsequent to 1789. Far from crushing the individual, the fascist state multiplies his energies. Just as in a regiment a soldier is not diminished, but multiplied by the number of his fellow soldiers. The fascist state organizes the nation, but it leaves the individual adequate elbow room. It has curtailed useless or harmful liberties, which preserving those which are essential. It has curtailed useless or harmful liberties while preserving those which are absolutely essential. In such matters, the individual cannot be the judge, but the state only. The fascist state is not indifferent to religious phenomena in general, nor does it maintain an attitude of indifference to Roman Catholicism. This is important. The special positive religion of Italians. The state has not got a theology, but it has a moral code. The fascist state sees in religion one of the deepest of spiritual manifestations, and for this reason, it is not only respects religion, but defends and protects it. The fascist state does not attempt, as did Robespierre at the height of the revolutionary delirium of the convention, to set up a, quote, God of its own, nor does it vainly seek, as does Bolshevism, to efface God from the soul of man. Fascism respects the God of ascetics, saints, and heroes, and it also respects God as conceived by the ingenious and primitive heart of the people, the God to whom their prayers are raised. The fascist state expresses the will to exercise the power and to command. Here the Roman tradition is embodied in a conception of strength. Imperial power, as understood by the fascist doctrine, is not only territorial, or military, or commercial, it is also spiritual and ethical. An imperial nation, that is to say a nation which directly or indirectly is a leader of others, can exist without the need of conquering a single square mile of territory. Fascism sees in the imperialistic spirit, i.e., in the tendency of nations to expand, a manifestation of their vitality, and the opposite tendency, which would limit their interests to the home country. It sees a symptom of decadence. People who rise or rear-rise are imperialistic. Renunciation is a characteristic of dying peoples. Let me repeat this, okay? The fascist state expresses the will to exercise power and to command through the Roma tradition. Roman tradition is embodied in a conception of strength. Imperial power, as understood by the fascist doctrine, is not only territorial, or military, or commercial, it is also spiritual and ethical. An imperial nation, that is to say, a nation which, directly or indirectly, is a leader of others, can exist without the need of conquering a single square mile of territory. Fascism sees in the imperialistic spirit, i.e., in the tendency of nations to expand, a manifestation of their vitality. In the opposite tendency, which would limit their interests to the home country, it sees a symptom of decadence. People who rise or rear-rise are imperialistic. Renunciation is characteristic of dying peoples. The fascist doctrine is that best suited to the tendencies and feelings of a people which, like the Italian, after lying fallow during centuries of foreign servitude, are now reasserting themselves in the world. But imperialism implies discipline, the coordination of efforts, a deep sense of duty, and a spirit of self-sacrifice. This explains many aspects of the practical activity of the regime, in the direction taken by many of the forces of the state, as also the severity which is to be exercised towards those who would oppose the spontaneous and inevitable movement of the 20th century Italy by agitating outgrown ideologies of the 19th century, ideologies rejected wherever great experiments in political and social transformations are being dared. Never before have the people thirsted for authority, directions, order, as they do now. If each age has its doctrine, the numerous symptoms indicate that the doctrine of our age is the fascist. That it is vital is shown by the fact that it has aroused a faith. That his faith has conquered souls is shown by the fact that fascism can point to its fallen heroes and its martyrs. Fascism is now acquired throughout the world, that universally which belongs to all doctrines, which by achieving self-expression represent a moment in the history of human thought. That's it. Sorry if I made some mistakes. This is my first ever time reading. But if you enjoyed it, I'd like you to tell me if you enjoyed it. And if you would like to see me read again, then please do tell me. And if you have any criticisms, if you're a fascist, if you're an anti-fascist, I would like to hear them. I'm very open to any form of criticism or compliment or constructive criticism or outright slander, because a fascist doesn't let things such as that get to him. All right.